So in our final panel today, we're going to have a little bit of a cleanup mix. One part of the panel, one part of the conversation is going to think about this problem of influence in a particular institutional context. That will be Luigi Zingales' introduction, and the response to that will come after on the third panelist. Then number two, we'll invite Ian to complement this and add some other insights that I've relied. I'm sure he's going to talk about stuff that I've relied upon a lot in thinking about this problem for informational purposes. And then number four, we will have a comment that's a little bit independent, but interestingly brings a bunch of data in to talk about the issue that we've been framing here about different kinds of corruption and how it develops. I'm going to briefly introduce, because all of you have the information of bios in your packets. The first, Luigi Zingales, who is a professor at the University of Chicago Business School and has written extensively in the context of what I think of as government capture. He's written a fantastic book with a colleague, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. He's written that book as himself a kind of libertarian capitalist, so he's not a critic as much as he is a critic of the corruption of this very process. So I'm very eager to welcome him to the presentation and to invite him to take the stage.
So thank you very much, Larry, for inviting me here. I think this has been a fantastic conference, not only for, of course, the theme and the subject, but also for the variety of people participating. I think that we don't do enough of interdisciplinary research, and I feel very often that I'm sort of in the dark because I know my field very well, but I know the limitation of my field, and I don't know what is outside, although enough what is outside. And I think that this conference has been fantastic in that respect. And also, I felt sort of immediately at home in many respects. First of all, when Robert Padman was talking about sort of the country of origin and mistrust, I'm Italian and I have a very low level of trust in everything. And then when Mazen was describing I think it was a doctor that did not want to become an organ donor, because she did not trust. That's exactly me. Actually, when I came in, she was talking about that. I thought she was talking about me. How does she know about me? Because that's exactly what happened the first time I was asked for the driving license, do you want to be an organ donor? My answer was no. And then I thought about it. I said, why did I say no out of the cut? And I said, because I don't trust the doctors to actually make the right decision. And actually that was influential because I used this in some measure of trust in Italy. I used sort of blood donation and participation to organ donation sort of groups as a measure of trust, because I think it's highly correlated with trust. And then I spent more time trying to ask doctors if they make the decision. And finally, I am an organ donor, even if to this day I'm not 100% sure that on the margin it doesn't make a difference. And being an economist, I think that this is a nice lead into my sort of topic, because being an economist, I'm used to think about how things matter on the margin. And one of the advantages, there are many disadvantages, but one of the advantages of being Italian and being exposed to everything that happens in Italy is that things are so blatant there that you cannot not see that, you cannot pretend that things are normal. And then when you come here and you look at the reality, say, here they are dressed up much better, less blatant, but is the world so different? And it says, I think that if there is one merit, and here I'm pushing the metaphor a bit hard, but if there is one merit of Berlusconi, he doesn't have very many, there is one merit, is that he's so open and clear what he does that makes it difficult not to see it. And when you see in him, I said, he's basically more vertically integrated than a lot of what happens in the United States. He owns everything from beginning to end. In the United States, sort of they sublet this to other people, but the process is not that different. Anyway, so that makes me sort of take a position that has already not gained me a lot of sympathy among my colleagues economists, because I try to sort of do a very simple operation of intellectual arbitrage that is also called logic, and say, in economics, and in particular in Chicago, there is this theory called regulatory capture that has been extremely influential. That says that sort of regulator tend to sort of act in the interest of the industry they regulate rather than in the interest of the public at large. And now, the reason is not because regulators are bad people. We saw an example of a wonderful lady earlier that was sort of speaking. So it's because regulators are in an environment where they need data, they are judged by the industry, they are pressure, and as a result, they might sort of give up or sort of be on the margin bias as a result of all these pressures. And what makes sort of regulatory capture such a powerful theory is precisely because it's not the old-fashioned corruption, but it's institutional corruption, very much in the way that Larry has defined it. So if you sort of push the argument, I think there are three major considerations why we think sort of regulators tend to be biased, is career concerns both for future outside job, but also the ability to disrupt internal career. And this ability sort of goes all over the place. I don't know how much you follow from the financial world, but there are two episodes that I think recent that are worth pointing out. There is the head of the European Banking Authority that has taken a very aggressive position in what the banks should book their assets at in this moment and how much they should be capitalized. And he has been harassed by the industry participants to the point that actually the head of the Italian Banking Association said in a public interview that they wanted to sue him personally for what he has done. So that's a pretty strong harassing, as harassing goes. And another example, which is doubly interesting because brings a moral sort of dilemma, is the head of the Swiss Central Bank had to resign because his wife traded in a way that is at least consistent with sort of taking advantage of his position. And I think that his resignation are absolutely warranted. So I'm not trying to defend him in any possible form or shape. However, what is interesting is this information was leaked to the press by an employee of a bank who stole some documents that were private and gave it to a politician who went on a public podium and released all this information. It just happens that this guy was hated by the banking sector. If he was not hated by the banking sector, I wonder whether he would have received the same treatment. So that's one example of how sort of this pressure exists. Then, of course, there are the information needs that are already described, and then there is the environmental pressure, the audience, the people you spend time with, the socialization, and so on and so forth. So are we sort of academic and academic economists in particular different in any sense? So if we define academics capture as the analog of this, now the question is, are there present the same forces? And so here I start from the assumption that all of us academics are as honest as all the regulators. And so it's not an issue of being sort of corrupt in the old-fashioned way. It's the issue of incentives in the broad sense of the word. And so here I'm going to try to sort of see how this incentive played out. So let's start from environmental pressure. I think that it's clear that there are environmental pressure. For example, a colleague of mine wrote a paper about some state regulator not in the banking industry not doing their job very properly, has been harassed by the state regulator in any major way. It makes his life more difficult. Another one, a former student, wrote a dissertation, actually a paper, showing that one of the major data set that is available was backfilled with information by the provider. And he was threatened of being sued by this company, and only because the business school stood up to him and said, look, we're going to pay you your legal expenses, that this data company was a bit more lenient and they didn't go ahead and fight. So basically what he's saying is that if you take a very harsh position, your life is more miserable. If you take a position that is more sort of lenient with the industry, your life is easier, exactly like the regulator. So I'm not saying that there is any difference in any possible form or shape. The second thing is data. Regulators need data. Researchers need data too. And in particular, it depends on what field you are, but I happen to be in finance. I know it's not a particular popular field here, but I happen to be in finance. And in many areas of finance, data are confidential. In fact, one of the big advantages, and I will come back later, of asset pricing is that it's based on a publicly available data set, which is crisp, with all the stock prices. And so you can criticize the industry, the mutual fund industry, etc., and you still have access to the database. Now, if I do research in venture capital, it's very difficult to have data that are not publicly available. I need to basically talk to a venture capitalist. And if I trash the venture capital industry, my chances of getting that data is not particularly strong. And even if the good researcher, when they get private data, they don't accept any conditionality. There is an implicit conditionality, because the moment I trash the industry, that's the last paper I write with confidential data. It's a bit like Michael Woodward. He made a career after Watergate to write sort of very nice biographies of people. He gets enormous access to data, and he treats his sort of character better than they should. Now, are there puffy pieces? No. And this is when he wrote about George W. Bush, it was very difficult to make him look like a hero. But still, he was much better than he is. And why? Because he got access to the data. And he understands, I think, that's my hypothesis, he thinks there is a quid pro quo, and people who give them the data understand this quid pro quo. So I think that's sort of one aspect where I think there is capture by academics as much as there is sort of this by the industry. And in many cases, is even sort of anticipation of that. So I know that a certain topic would be more controversial, so I don't even ask the data to search for a certain topic, because I know I'm going to get into trouble, so I don't sort of publish this. So nobody really is doing anything bad. The result, however, is that the collection of evidence is biased. I always cringe when I hear people all evidence suggests that. And it's true, all evidence suggests that, but you have to ask yourself the question, what were the incentives to collect that evidence? That evidence, even if it's academic evidence, is not unbiased. And so before you jump to conclusion based on the collective academic evidence, you have to ask yourself the question, what are the incentives? And sort of I don't want to, since we are hosted by Harvard, bash too much Harvard Business School, but the cases at Harvard are an example of this, because those are actually subject to release by the company. So they do portray a disproportional, beautiful image of the company that they describe. Not only that, they selectively withdraw cases after the fact when things don't look good. So trying to find any of the Enron cases that Harvard Business School wrote, they're not in the system. And they wrote many, and they were like gigantic praises of Enron, not about only the business model, but also about their investment in India that, of course, are being rumored to be highly corrupted. And I think field studies are the same. And economics is going, and I think rightly so, is a fascinating area into field studies. Field studies are going to be much more subject to this pressure than the traditional archival sort of study where you look at data on CRISP or something like that. So there is a difference a bit. The major difference between sort of regulators and academics is on the career stuff. In a sense, on the regulator, there are two ways in which sort of industry can affect your career. One is outside job afterward, and that's pretty similar because you have consulting, you have board appointment, you have expert witness thing that for academics, they apply as much as sort of for regulators. So this is not really the big difference. The big difference is that we have tenure. It's not clear exactly why we have tenure, but I think in this particular case, it's a pretty good fact that we have tenure because we cannot be fired. So we can say everything we want. There was a gentleman earlier that was complaining about Harvard Economic Department not having Marxists. Actually, there is a Marxist guy, that Margley. It's you? One, yeah, but he's sort of decided to sort of become Marxist after tenure, and he's still there. So I think that's a useful thing to some extent. But the sort of, and this is an example in a recent book of one bank lobbyist that was trying to find an academic saying something negative about Fannie and Freddie. And they said, no, because even if you pay me very much for this job, you're not going to be there for the next 20 years paying me. And so I ruin my future consulting opportunity by writing this paper for you, so I don't write it. And that, I think, is something that is very subtle. Speaking of institutional corruption, this is where my Italian experience helps tremendously. One No. One aspect I never understood before, but one aspect why sort of class action suits are good is because they create in the legal profession a constituency on the other side. Because in Italy, not existing class action suit, all the lawyers, if they want to make a living as lawyers, they basically have to cater to large companies. And most lawyers, unlike here, most practicing lawyers in Italy are also academic. So they also write the theory based on their interest. And so it's a closed circle, and there is no remedy because the theory is designed to please the very corporate interest that these guys work for. And at least in the United States, there is a bit more variety because you can make a living by being sort of a class action guy. So I think that is very difficult to uproot because so if I want to find an expert in Italy that is not part of this environment, I have to hire him or her abroad. Because no matter how much I pay one guy for one particular consulting, I ruin his or her career. And so I cannot pay enough. And that's exactly what this is saying. But the main difference between regulators and academics is that our career, at least up to tenure, and then after tenure, I think part of our pay, is based on publication of papers. So unless I can prove that this thing is somehow biased, I think there is a major difference between regulators and non-regulators, which is the internal career. So I try to think, how can I show some evidence of this bias in the process? So I pick on one topic, which I think is particularly interesting because it's not homogeneously in one way or another in academia, which is how much exactly are paid. So let's first start off saying, is there some influence on the editors? Because unlike in law review, where there is competition, you send your papers in a lot of places, and whoever takes it first, you publish. In economics, you submit a paper, you wait for 6 or 7, 8 months, you have a revised resubmit if you're lucky, and then sort of you revise and resubmit, you wait for another 6 or 7 months, and then probably you get another revised and resubmit. So by the end of like 3 years, you finally are close to having an acceptance, and at that point you're up for review, so it's very important. And the editor says, why don't you change this particular spin on this particular thing? And very few people have the courage to say, even after tenure, to say, no, I'm going to restart the process from scratch because I don't like the spin that the editors put in that particular thing. So number one, the editors have a huge spinning power. Number two, they have a huge amount of power in picking the referee and basically picking the result because people are very predictable in their answers. So if I pick the right referee, sort of I get a paper through. If I pick the wrong referee, I don't get the paper through. So editors are tremendously important. In fact, I hate to do referees, so I decided to advertise to editors that I am going to be always biased in favor of acceptance. So I get very few papers and the good ones, because the only one that they want to publish are the good ones. So it's optimal, actually, as a strategy. It's optimal as a referee to follow this strategy. Anyway, that's a long story to say. Let's first look at the composition of the major finance and economic journal in terms of how many of them sit on a board or they consult and do expert witness. And as you say, there is the first one, the Journal of Financial Economics, that is at the top of the list in that respect. But everybody, except the Journal of Political Economy, for some strange reason, they have nobody that does, at least in my search, nobody that does any consulting or any corporate board. Everybody else has sort of some element and more or less of this. Now you say, so what? This doesn't create any bias whatsoever. So I wanted to prove that there is a bias. And to do that, I use actually a recent survey that expert panel that a colleague of mine at Harvard, Chicago, put it together, which is actually very interesting. I suggest you look at it. It's called the expert panel. It's basically 42 experts from several universities, top universities, different political orientation, different fields, that they answer with an agreement, disagreement, or I don't know, and also a degree of confidence to some questions that are policy relevant. And so I succeeded after a bit of fight to include in the panel, because most of the questions are very sort of if you increase the tax rate by 1%, would you increase more revenue, something like that. Very technically quite boring. So I finally succeeded in putting interesting questions, which are, is the typical chief executive officer of a publicly traded corporation in the US paying more than his or her marginal contribution to firm's value? Okay? And already to have this formulation I fought, because I actually prefer something else, which was try to bias in the opposite direction, see how they reacted. But you will see the answer are quite interesting. The second is mandating the say on pay, whether that's a good idea or not. So to my surprise, actually, in 32% of economists of this panel agree that the typical CEO is overpaid, 30% are uncertain, and 7% disagree. And similarly, you have the say on pay. If it's good, actually the agreement is a bit larger, 45%, 20% uncertain, and 7% disagree. So then my question is, if you belong to a board, corporate board, do you have a different opinion? Now, I have to say, I belong to this panel. I actually belong to a corporate board, so I excluded my observation because that will bias the sample. So if you look at the rest, you do find that experts who belong to a corporate board are 4 times more likely to disagree with the fact that the executives are overpaid, and 4 times more likely to disagree that pay on say is good. Now, you could argue that by belonging to a corporate board, you know the real world, so you're more confident and knowledgeable about what is right and what is wrong in this particular field, while if you are a labor economist who don't even know what a corporate board is, I'm exaggerating, they might sort of not know any better. However, I don't find any effect of your belonging to a board on your degree of confidence. So it's not that you're more confident with the answer, it's just that you are actually more likely to be pro board. And now, I think that psychologists can go wild here on what are the interpretation, whether you're trying to defend your ego, your participation, but I let you decide what is the form, but what I care at this point is that your opinion on an objective fact, this is a pretty objective fact, and for full disclosure, I said uncertain because I don't think we have enough fact either way. But the fact that the people who sit on the board are more certain that is not the case, I think is interesting. And so then my question is, does it matter this on the type of publications that we have? So if the editors are more biased in one way or another, does this bias translate into more publication of one type or the other? So now, ideally, if I had sort of a perfect measure of quality, I will have like 3 obvious propositions I would like to test. Number 1, per given quality, papers that reach the right conclusions are published more, I should say, first. Second, are more cited. Cross-sectionally, you should see that because all these incentives are strong in a business school, faculty in a business school should do more of that than others. Now, of course, the big problem is the moment I start to doubt about publication and even citation, because citation is a result, number 1, of being published, number 2, of the editors. I don't know whether that ever happened to you, but to me it happened very often that in the last round, the editor suggested a few sort of citations I had to add to the list. And of course, are you going to sort of fight that and sort of, no. So I think that if the process is biased, bias sort of the citation and bias the publication, so I cannot use this as an objective measure of quality. So what am I left with? It's something that is sort of not fantastic, but I use SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, and they have a measure of downloads. How many times the paper is downloaded? Now, because it takes a few minutes to download a paper, if you're not interested, you're not downloading the paper. There are a lot of papers that I glance and I say, this is boring, I don't download. So I think that I use this as indicator of interest in the topic at the very minimum. And then sort of, I want to make also as a measure somehow quality not affected by any institutional thing, because anybody with a computer can access and download. So it's not like this is biased. And so I took the top 150 papers on the topic of executive compensation in SSRN in the period pre-crisis, both not to have the crisis that mess up things and also to leave some time for publication. And then I classify them on the base of the abstract on papers that are positive on the level of compensation, whether they say it is okay or they even pay too little. Believe it or not, there are some. And negative on level, they're paid too much. And then the same with slope, positive on slope, okay, or too little sensitivity, and sort of negative on slope, that is too much sensitivity. And so this is the sample statistics. So as you see, there are sort of 15% that are positive on level, 20% that are negative on level, and similar statistic for slope. So now I want to see sort of how, if there is a difference in the composition depending on where the stuff eventually get published. So given that I belong to a restricted set of highly downloaded papers, so if you think that's a good measure of quality, valuable paper, 5 years later, how many of those are published and where? And you see that if you are positive on level, you are much more likely to be published in an economic journal. And if you're negative, you're less likely. And in sort of, if you're negative on level, even managerial reviews don't want you, and so on and so forth. Now, this is just in terms of journal. Then I want to see sort of citations. And here I use the download of SSRN as a measure of control. So I have on the left-hand side how many Google Scholar citations there are for these papers. And this is controlling for the SSRN download. I see that the more positive you are on level, the more likely you are to have citation down the line. And if you think that you want a smaller slope, you're much less likely to be cited down the line. So if you think that it's not just publication, but also citation and make the difference in your career, it's clear that as a young, so if I were to advise a young sort of assistant professor that works on this topic, the first thing I'd say, don't work on this topic. But if I were to advise him working on this topic and you want to maximize your chance of tenure, I say, look, write a paper that is very positive on level and slope, and that will increase your chances of getting tenure. And then I look at whether there is a difference among this paper on what the sort of affiliation of authors in terms of content. And there is a clear relationship. If you have no authors that have any affiliation with the business school, you are less likely to write a paper which is positive on level. Which is interesting. And this is true even, I had to create a Babchak dummy because Lucian Babchak has written so many papers on this topic that I didn't want him to sort of bias the sample. And even controlling for a paper written by him, the results are there. Now, sort of, you can discuss that there are also some differences, of course, in sort of with other factors, but given I have short amount of time, I don't want to spend too much on this. What I sort of want to dispel, because as economists, most economists will say, okay, I see all this evidence, so what? There is competition, and sort of competition will play out. Now, I think that that's true only as long as there is a level playing field. Clearly, if there is a big sort of venture capital industry interested in promoting how great is venture capital, there's not a lot of people on the other side. So what makes a paper interesting, even before all these things, when I think about a topic, and I think about if I find a paper in which the venture capital industry is a disaster, is such a really interesting paper? No. But if I find that adds value all over the place, that's an interesting paper. And that motivates me and other people to search in one direction. And unfortunately, the act of search is sort of not equal, and as a result, even assuming no bias whatsoever in the process, it's just the fact that many more resources are sort of employed in digging out certain type of evidence, much less on the opposite, and in a court of law, you know who wins in that situation. So what are potential remedies? I think the first one, as usual, is awareness. And it says, these things, I don't claim I'm saying anything particularly novel or controversial. I think that I'm saying something actually boring and obvious. And in spite of that, I get a lot of reaction, which suggests to me that sort of most people are not aware of the phenomenon. So just bringing the phenomenon up to sort of the attention, I think is useful. The second thing is sort of I would like to have a better disclosure of data code, of data, or even a sort of a data code for people. So if, first of all, you have to disclose, and I think this in many journals, especially sort of scientific journals, not economic journals, you have a disclosure of sort of whether there was any restriction in the publication of the results. But we do have, this colleague of mine used work from the Federal Reserve, that is confidential data from the Federal Reserve, that shows that the state regulators are worse than the Federal Reserve. And he now is in trouble because the state regulators hate him and accuse him of being completely captured by the Federal Reserves. The Federal Reserves don't want even to show this data because they are afraid that, first of all, many of the members of the Fed before were state regulators, so it's sort of costly. Long story. So I think it's very important to have more access to data and more clearly specified access to data, and to have a discount. If I use confidential data that are not accessible to others, I think the standard of publication should be much higher and should be very clearly disclosed at the beginning of the paper, and in any sort of meta-analysis or survey review, etc., this should be factored in, because this clearly sort of biases the sample. The third thing is that while I don't think having graduate students referee your paper is great, it's great because I don't have to do it, but it's not great for the quality of the paper, I do think that the law sort of publishing market is better. It's funny that the economists tend to be in favor of competition in everything except in submitting papers. So I think that having competition among different journals, you send it to everybody and they pick, I think is a great innovation that will reduce the power of editors. Because really what gives an enormous power of editors is that they keep you waiting for 2 years, and by the end, you're completely held up. You have no chance. And then there are sort of two ideas. One is mine and one is actually Larry. I am sort of, I love the idea of shaming. I think this is another a good, a very popular activity, but I found that shaming is the most powerful force in inducing fixing in this problem. So in my activity in corporate governance in Italy, one of the things I do, I write regularly for a newspaper there. And every time I expose something bad, regularly there is a reaction and there is a response. And I've seen that also now on the other side. I'm on a corporate board, and the thing they are mostly concerned is what is going to appear in the press. And so you can have all the corporate governance you want, they find a tricky way to bypass them, because there is this expression in Italy, the moment you have a law, you find a way around it. That is the reason why people don't trust the system. But when you shame them publicly, I think people react. And you sort of hit one to educate 100, because the moment one is hit, then everybody else is afraid. And people are not going to do it in anticipation that it will be embarrassed in the future. And some people at the law school told me that one of their colleagues, when we went up for tenure, had a piece that was written for a sort of job that was pretty mediocre, actually bad. And he said, "Oh, I hope you understood that I was writing that for money," which is sort of an indication that in the profession it's okay to prostitute yourself if you do it for money, but we want to still be sort of innocent in academic environment. So when you bring these two worlds together, I think that people will be much more careful. The second, which is Larry's idea, which I think is a great idea and a little bit less sort of aggressive than mine, is to sort of rate people, rate economists on the basis of independence on topics. So I really admire a couple of sort of legal scholars I know that told me, I wanted to keep writing on this subject publicly, so I didn't take any consulting job on this particular issue, which I think is really remarkable. That's the way everybody should do, but unless you talk to them personally, you don't know the difference. And it happened twice to me in my sort of public intellectual career, that people had approached me to write newspaper article, op-ed article for money. And they were clearly, they approached me because either I've written in the past on that topic, or they knew I was sympathetic. So it's not that they would have banned my conviction, but it would have sort of prevented my freedom in the next time to criticize them or to sort of dump on them and they've done something wrong. And what is amazing is that this disclosure does not exist. And it says, if it happened to me that I'm not sort of Paul Krugman, it must happen to everybody else. And why this is not publicly disclosed, I think that that's really important, and trying to sort of rate people. And this might be very much on topic, because there are some people that on certain topic, they are completely open. In other, that's the area of expertise, especially people who do expert consulting. It does pay to have absolutely a unilateral view of the world in expert consulting. That's the reason why you're hired. One of the few times I did it, the lawyer said, you're not a good expert consultant, you have written too much. I had one guy spend a month reading everything you have written. And it's difficult that you never got yourself in contradiction. I think in that particular case I didn't. But it's not easy. And if you want to be a good expert consultant, you act in advance. And what you do is you write always on one side of the issue in a very consistent, homogeneous way. So I think that this idea are just small attempts to go in that direction. Thank you.
So next, not necessarily in thematic order, but next in actual order is going to be Ian Ayres, who's professor of law at Yale. And so up here.
Thank you.
And so I'm going to try to talk some more about remedies, approaches different categories of remedies when we think there is a corruption concern. And I'm going to try to apply that both to the problem of economic capture that we just heard, and to the problem of campaign finance, if I can pull that off. And just in the spirit of the last presentation, let me disclose that for several years I was the editor of the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization, and I'm probably subject to system justification that I'm not quite alert to. So the idea here, and Larry, is this working, we think? So one meta approach to the problem of at least some kinds of corruption is to try to insulate one sphere from the influences of another sphere. And so we have an economic editor who's supposed to be making publication decisions on merit, where we have public officials who are supposed to be making their actions on merit. We want to insulate them from influences outside of that sphere, from the economic, in both cases maybe from the economic sphere. And one reaction is to question whether that insulation is feasible. There is a very strong group of people out there who believe that power will out, and that, and matter of fact, among that group would be Brandeis, who said, we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. That it's not, you just can't insulate democracy from, at some point, from powerful concentrations of wealth. So what, if you are an insulation skeptic, well, what can you do? You can try to get more radical, and for example, you might try then not to work on the insulation between the two spheres, but you might try to correct the biases in the outer sphere. Very hard to do. You might try to reduce concentration of wealth. You might try to have editors be the shareholders of these outside corporations. And how in the world would you ever pull this off? But it is at least one approach. And there's chicken and egg problems of how to do this. Maybe we could have moments of Occupy mobilization that get us to do some things. Another approach that might be a response to those that are skeptical that you can effectively insulate is dilution reform. Well, we can't stop those polluting influences, but under this dilution idea, we could instead try the solution to pollution is dilution, that we're just going to try to counteract it by pumping, and Larry suggested this, Bruce Ackerman and I have suggested this, let's give a bunch of publicly financed vouchers, and you have to be careful, not just public money, that in itself could be centrally distributed in corrupting ways, but we'll try to, if you want democratically distributed influence in campaign finance, have voucher reforms here. This could be applied, the dilution solution can be applied with regard to publishing, that you could do it with regard to in investigative journalism. You could have public finance of investigative journalism that is based on vouchers, that actually the readers have in a sense mini vouchers with their clicks, and that the investigative articles that garner more clicks get more support. And we might not be able, and even in academic publishing, we may not be able to stop the influence, but we might be able to provide some public finance and think about in a voucherized system is, can we somehow dilute out its impact? But I do want to take this view. I'm not, to me it's an empirical question whether insulation is possible, and there are a variety, I think, of ways that tools that might be used to insulate one sphere from another. And so I now want to kind of turn toward those. And we're going to see that they actually have counterparts in both the academic publishing and in campaign finance. So one of the big ideas is that we can use information reform, and indeed we hear from Luigi and from lots of people. One of the big ideas is transparency, more disclosure. And maybe the biggest idea that I want to propound during this short presentation is I think that we put too much, we're following the wrong God when it comes to transparency, and that this slide, I'd say, instead of Transparency International, this wonderful movement, they're under the wrong flag. And instead, I think we should march under the idea of Symmetry International, of we should strive for symmetric information, not transparent information. And what do I mean by, as applied to campaign finance, this is a very simple idea, that politicians shouldn't know more about the identity of their donors than the public does. That's different. That claim of having them being symmetrically informed is broader. One way you can get symmetric information is through transparency. The candidates know who their donors are, let the public know. But there are other ways, indeed, it's not there are other intermediate positions that can be done there. By the way, I am, and this idea of symmetry, one of the ways is through transparency, and in fact, in economic publishing, we're still behind this symmetry principle. If you want to cash it out through transparency, we're behind medical journals, and I published in New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, and they required a lot more from me than I required as editor of J. Leo. And it's not that hard to ask a couple extra questions. Have you received, done any consulting in this area or done any business stuff? And I don't think we did that. It's easy, an easy thing to do. Matter of fact, just since you're in favor of shaming, I have taken lots of money in doing business, expert witnessing in disparate impact cases in finance, racial disparate impact cases, and I was criticized by the great James Heckman in a piece that he published. He criticized a piece that I wrote where I had disclosure. He went after me, and 3 weeks later, he gave a deposition against me in one of these cases, and he didn't drop a footnote. And it would be better to drop a footnote in the published piece, and so we could, as far as low-hanging fruit, bring ourselves up to the level of JAMA. And as a matter of fact, let me, and I'll come back to this in a second because I think there are even ways, some extra questions that we'll I'll come back to in just a moment. But besides, if we do take this idea of symmetry as opposed to transparency seriously, another option is that we use the idea of being symmetric, but having both the politicians and the public be symmetrically uninformed. And this idea is deeply American. It's as American as the voting booth, where neither the politicians nor the public know the identity of the person that I voted for president in the last election. And I've talked in the past about anonymity, but here I want to emphasize, just to give you an idea, that if we cared about symmetry, there are a variety of different, here are 3 different kinds of anonymity that we might embrace. There is a donation booth where you force people to, when making a donation, to do it through a blind trust. There's another approach that is, I'll call a refund booth, that under this, Lessig would be giving to Ron Paul. It would immediately, that contribution would immediately be publicly distributed on the internet. I guess I need to stand closer to this. Immediately publicly distributed, but in the next 2 weeks, you'd have the option of secretly seeking a refund. And there, for the people that care about transparency, that would be transparent that you initially gave some money, but we still might be able to avoid various kinds of extortion. The final kind of anonymity I call the Chilean booth, and it was implemented in Chile. And they have a different kind of anonymity that seems rather strange, that they give Lessig the option of either opting for transparent disclosure or contributing anonymously through a blind trust. And it's his decision. And there's an interesting question. It's not random why they did this. And by the way, ignore I couldn't in the short time stop it should all be the same color. That's a glitch on my part. But there's an interesting thing. Chile has a different concern of a different kind of corruption. The stories we tell ourselves in the United States about political corruption are more about the bribery and extortion of people, of contributors. But in Chile, there are huge reprisals if you give to the losing party. Your boss might fire you, and so it's you don't want the reprisals of not contributing or contributing to the wrong party are important. And so one of the beautiful things is when you're giving to the party that is likely to win, you can give publicly. But if you want to give to the Communist Party, Larry, give anonymously so that you don't get tarred and feathered. And so we might take and indeed, when I hear Luigi, the Chilean booth or approaches of anonymity where people actually could do expert witnessing, but in a way that preserved their anonymity so that they still might be able to, or anonymous publishing in various ways, there might be ways of adopting the kind of symmetry that is reducing of corruption. Now, if we do go the transparent route, well, let me just have a little aside here about transparency. I'd like you guys to try to internally, don't yell anything out for the moment, I'd like you to think of the number of sexual misconduct complaints that were filed at Yale University in the last 6 months. Yale has 5,000 undergraduates, they have 5,000 graduate students, about 10,000 students in the community. These are the number of complaints that can be brought by any member of the community, student, staff, faculty. It can be brought against any member of the community, student, staff, faculty. Okay, get that number in your head, and I'm going to now count to 3, and I want you each publicly to yell out a number for me. 1, 2, 3. 3. Great. Now you know you're committed to what that is. Now you can understand whether you're surprised. I'm about Yale, in a response to a Title IX justice investigation, tried to get ahead of what was minimally required, and they're about the only university, Harvard certainly doesn't do this, that every 6 months is going to report this number, and they just 2 days ago did their first report, public disclosure, and the answer is 52. And by the way, you can see the number, it's broken down here by, these are the respondents, these are in a sense the accused. And so 9 faculty members were accused of sexual harassment, 1 of sexual assault, whereas undergraduates, 5 were accused of harassment, 12 of sexual assault. Right, so this is the idea. How many of you had numbers lower than 52? Right, and so you might be surprised. Now you have to figure out what meaning does this have in a world where Harvard refuses to give, you guys do refuse to give this number, don't you?
So did
Yeah.
Yale until very recently.
What?
So did Yale until
I
very
know,
recently.
until they were investigated by the thing. But in the world of asymmetric disclosure by just one, there's this could have.
Wonderful model.
What are we going to do with it, right? Let me move, and I think it relates to this question too of the wonderful Putnam point about whether we care about trust or trustworthiness. I'm actually on the side, I care about the appearance and in some ways, and this is also what every university does have to do, is disclose how many crimes. And we have this as federally mandated. And the idea of all disclosures, whether they make people feel safer or less safe, is there are costs as well as great benefits. Another insulating approach besides information is to take independence, is to try to reform the rules of independence. And this is one that I just think there's lots we could do, and constitutionally. We haven't been talked a lot about the Constitution, but one way to think about, again, ignore the coloring ideas, but when we could either choose to regulate speech, the speaker, or we could choose to regulate the content of the speech. And so the Supreme Court makes a distinction between express advocacy and issue advocacy. That's the content of the speech. But they also make a distinction, and it's easier to regulate express advocacy, it has been in the past, and that's in decline. But it's particularly easy to still regulate coordinated versus independent speakers. Coordinated speakers, you can just stop them from spending money. All right, or you can limit them constitutionally in a lot of ways. Now, by the way, just on the academic side, because I do want to keep paying off a little bit on this, NBR, its big idea is to do express versus issue advocacy. I don't know if it's still going on, but they used to hire graduate students to read every NBR working paper and to stop those that were doing express advocacy.
They still do it.
They still do it, all right? And so, and we see the same thing as in campaign finance, Larry. People come up and say, oh, it's not express advocacy, but their issue advocacy sounds a lot like they have a thumb on the scale about how we should regulate compensation, right? An alternative way to do this, and I just didn't do this, but Yale focuses on coordinated versus independent. So I'm a co-founder of a for-profit company called Stick.com. I can't publish any experiments on it. No amount of disclosure. Yale just says you have a profit interest in a company, can't run experiments, can't publish them, right? So that's coordinated versus independent. On the academic side, we could do a lot more about regulating, broadening. And by the way, for about 20 years, a lot of academics were saying, oh, let's expand the definition of magic words of express advocacy. It's strange to me that we haven't made more progress on a policy of trying to expand what coordinated means. And there are lots of things we could do here to do this on both the academic side and on the candidate side. So one of the things is what I'll call before and after definitions of coordination. We could say that after you have, we could say that after you have taken money in a consulting, that you can't do this. But we can also say before, if you publish in our journal, you can't take money for the next 5 years in this area. Or we could, let me come back, there's just a disclosure version of this. Will you commit, Luigi, not to take consulting money on this area for the next 5 years? Just disclose that. They might say, no, Luigi wouldn't commit to this. So we know who we're doing. By the way, I was an amicus on a mutual fund fee case to the US Supreme Court. And within 6 months, I had been hired as an expert witness to do a report on the side that I had supported, right? And so it might have been helpful to the Supreme Court when I was an amicus to know whether I'd made this commitment. In contrast, Steve Levitt and I did a piece about an econometric piece on LoJack, and we privately committed ourselves that we'd never trade in LoJack, and they were offering us lots of money to go down after the fact give our paper to their conferences or their people, and we said no, we're trying to be pure. But why the hell we didn't drop a footnote committing to it in advance is just a lack of imagination. This before and after has analogs that could happen also with regard to people that are coming in and out. Okay, we're going to be very good on this. That are coming in and out of heading packs. By the way, just as a little aside, it's strange that Newt Gingrich can tell Romney's PAC to take down an ad. That sounds to me like coordination. The fact that it's public doesn't mean it's coordinated. He has even told his own PAC, and by the fact that everybody knows what is his PAC and Romney's PAC, but just it's an interesting issue that we could just, and this might lead toward recreating a kind of magic words within and out on the coordination side, just like we've had them on the express advocacy side. It's one thing for Gingrich to say he doesn't like an ad. It's another one for him to instruct people not to do it. And by the way, there are circumstances. I just love flipping things around here. So there are places where even though I want to have less coordination, there's places where you might want to have more coordination, and such as mandating shareholder approvals before corporations give money. That fits into a larger idea of coordination. And I do have a few ideas on how to attack Citizens United, but I think that's off subject enough that I'll just leave it there. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, so the third speaker, David Moss, is a professor at the Harvard Business School. He is in the Robert Putnam model here. I had invited all the speakers to withhold as much as they could their preparation until they heard what other people had said and then respond extemporaneously. And some of them were brave enough to do that. Robert Putnam was one. And David Moss, as well, has withheld his preparation until he's heard what other people have said. And so I'd like to encourage him now to come up and give his response.
Yeah, exactly right. It was like a lion who wanted to prepare, but he said, no, held back.
That's the first time I've ever been commended for not preparing. So that's great. So I did write down some notes while we were going here. And so thanks, Larry, very much for inviting me and for congratulating me on my poor preparation. So I guess what I thought I would do is just give the perspective since Luigi was so kind to reference Harvard Business School. You'll note he didn't reference, interestingly, his own business school, which I thought might actually be a reflection of bias, because if he does attack his own business school, then when he goes back, he'll have trouble. So he instead attacks ours, which I think was quite wise of him. But I actually think that the business school, or actually more generally, since we're in a law school, professional school, poses really very special challenge for thinking about exactly the types of capture. And I joke with Luigi, but I'm very sympathetic to the type of problem that he's describing. I think it's quite pervasive. But how do we think about it in the context of a business school or a law school or a medical school, any professional school? And I think these institutions, as I said, have some very special challenges, but I think they also maybe are particularly subject to this problem of institutional corruption, but in a way where it's not clear exactly even what the right direction is out of the conundrum. So let me just talk about that for a minute. When you think about a business school, or again, any professional school, on the one hand, they're part of the university. And as a result, the thinking about the faculty, we hope, should trigger some sense of independence, that scholarly independence is something that is valued in any part of the university. And at the same time, any professional school, I'll certainly say the business school that I'm part of, values connection to practice. And both in terms of the nature of the research and also in outside activity, including for money-making activity. And so I think that creates a problem, because in a sense the conflict, the institutional corruption, is baked right in to the nature of the institution. And in fact, as you move them further away from practice, in order to maybe clean up the act, which has much to recommend it. As you do that, there is some chance that you'll undermine the variability, their variability to do what they want to do. So not in a negative way, but that is they want to be close to practice so that they understand practice. So how do you navigate that? So anyway, I wanted to start by, I did think last night, worrying that I didn't really know what Luigi was going to say, that I had to prepare something. So I actually, since I'm a historian, I thought I would, and I see at least one other historian in the room, I hope others. I wanted to tell you that this problem of outside activities is definitely not a new problem. That is making money on the outside. So the rule at Harvard, at least at the business school, I think at Harvard University, is that we can work 50 days a year and make money outside of Harvard. If you go over that, then there's, I presume, hell to pay, but I don't know whether people go over that or not. So in any case, it turns out this has been a long-standing issue and problem. And the reason why I know that is, to my knowledge, there's only been one faculty member in the history of Harvard Business School who has ever been stripped of his professorship or tenure. And that was someone named Arthur Dewing in 1933. And I thought I'd maybe just tell you a little bit the story of Arthur Dewing, and this is in the nature of I had to prepare something, but I actually think there might be some relevance to this. So Arthur Dewing was actually a philosophy professor at Harvard for many years, and then he had a real interest in finance and did very well in finance. And he then came over to the business school in the 20s, and he taught at the business school, and he was a successful teacher. And he was one of the most active proponents of the case method, which we still have today. He believed this was, and it was actually from his philosophy work, he thought this was a superior form of pedagogy. He proselytized, he taught, he was very effective. He also was very effective, very, very effective at making money on the outside, and he did quite a bit of that. Now, so he was, we'll get to, he quit voluntarily, according to the Harvard Corporation. According to many others, he was fired on May 8th, 1933. Now, what happened leading up to May 8th, 1933? So in early March 1933, right as President Roosevelt was just about to take over and was soon going to declare a bank holiday, because the banks were in Michigan, had already had bank runs, and all the banks in Michigan were closed, and actually from state to state, governors were closing the banks in their states one by one. And Arthur Dewing, Professor Dewing, was not fond of Franklin Roosevelt. He hated him, and he hated everything he stood for. Anyway, whether that had anything to do with it or not, Mr. Dewing walked into the Harvard Trust Company, bank in Cambridge, and in Harvard Square, and he walked in one day and very conspicuously, so as the documents say, very conspicuously withdrew $30,000 in gold. And this was seen as quite an affront because it was believed that he was trying intentionally to spark a bank run. Now, he says he wasn't trying to spark a bank run, that actually, in retrospect, he said that at one of his outside activities, he was the president of a water company, and he was involved in some kind of expansion project, and he was worried that the bank was going to be closed, which turned out to be true. And so he wanted to take out the money so he could continue the expansion, and he didn't want to put any of his workers out of work. So he wanted to be able to pay them, and as soon as the bank did close, and as soon as it reopened, he put the money back in. Now, not long after that, most likely in April or May, Dean Wallace Dunham, so remember there's Dewing, who's the professor, and there's Dunham, who was our dean back then, and this was one of the most famous dean, probably the most famous dean at Harvard Business School. He's the one who also championed the case method and made it the foundation that sort of everyone teaches by the case method because of Dean Dunham. Well, he asked for Dewing's resignation. And many observers believed it was because of this whole gold episode, the withdrawing of $30,000. And in fact, it appears that Dunham was a supporter of Roosevelt, and he was apparently very angry. But although he was very angry, his faculty colleagues convinced him not to do anything to Dunham, that this was a speech right, that Dewing hadn't done anything wrong. Everything he had done with respect to the gold was legal. And so it is not, from what I can tell, and there's actually pretty good documentary evidence, that is not why he was fired. The bigger issue, it turns out, is that Dean Dunham had long thought that Professor Dewing was too involved in outside activities. And it turns out that some months before the gold episode, he had called in Dewing and said, look, I'm hearing reports that you're not prepared for class, that you're walking in unprepared, the students are disappointed, your fellow colleagues are complaining about it, and I'm looking at the activities. They were required to give a list of outside activities. We still are today. And he said, your list is awfully long. I think you're doing too much. Would you commit to not take on any new outside activities? And Dewing said he would. He promised he would not take on any new outside activities. Well, unluckily for Dewing, Dean Dunham had a vacation home in Chatham, Massachusetts on the Cape. And the reason why that matters is as he was traveling out to his vacation home, probably in April, he happened to see the Chatham Water Company. And on the billboard outside the Chatham Water Company was the name President Arthur Dewing. And it turns out that Arthur Dewing had bought the Chatham Water Company and made himself president. And that was not on his list of outside activities. So Dean Dunham comes back, he's furious, he calls in Dewing, and he says, I just want to be clear, have you taken on any new outside activities since we last spoke? The answer was no. Everything on your list is accurate. Yes. So Dunham then accused him of lying and asked immediately for his resignation, and Dewing agreed and gave his resignation right then. So anyway, the point of that is that outside activities have been an issue for Harvard Business School for a long time. My guess is also for Chicago, but maybe not. So the question, though, is there you see what was the punishment? Why was there punishment in this case? There was punishment in this case because it was not because of a conflict of interest and his research was somehow biased, right? The punishment was because it was diverting him from his teaching. It was diverting him from his responsibilities, his actual compensated responsibilities at the school. And my sense is that's still true today. The concern is much more about, is it diverting your attention than is it biasing your research or your thinking? So I think that's an issue and something that we should be concerned about. If you fast forward up to today, and Luigi alluded to it, I think one of the biggest challenges, certainly for my school, but I think for many schools, is this issue with regard to case studies. So this is a very difficult issue, and Luigi said that there are some problems of bias built in because you have to get permission from the company to approve the case. Most faculty actually will not, they require total approval or they won't do the case. They don't usually allow selective approval, but maybe some do. So there's that form of bias. But there are other forms of bias as well. One which it turns out that best practices cases sell much, much better than worst practices cases. And so people prefer best practices cases. And that probably introduces some bias. But another form of bias, or at least potential bias, is that many people, or at least some people who are writing these cases, are also consulting for the companies. In some cases, they're actually on the board of the companies. In some cases, they're officers of the companies. And so that now, if they're on the board, I think they're actually technically supposed to report that on the case. I can't remember seeing that, but I think that's right. But in these other cases, if you're a consultant or if you're an officer, I don't actually think you need to report it, certainly not as a consultant. And so I think that this poses a very significant challenge. And this is maybe just an extreme form, but it gets to the basic idea. So on the one hand, what the students will tell you, I bet, is that if they were to rate the cases, those that someone who is involved in the company wrote, they probably see as a better case. There's more texture, there's more detail. My guess is that there's also bias. Probably not really aggressive conscious bias, although maybe in some cases. But my sense is there'd be a tendency to try to highlight more positive things and probably maybe not include as many negative things. And so that's a problem. Again, to me, it seems that there's just no question, though, that there's bias there. And so one has to think about two possible remedies. It seems at an absolute minimum, there needs to be disclosure. It should be on the first page of the case, so-and-so, I don't know that you need to say the exact amount of money, but maybe a range of money that was earned from that company, something to that effect. How many days were worked. Certainly an officer, certainly a board member. So it seems to me that disclosure is at an absolutely the minimum standard. And I would say that the school, at least my school, is moving in that direction. My guess is we'll get to that. We're not there yet, but my guess is we'll get to that result. The harder question, I think, again, harder in that it's just a harder question, not harder to get to. So we haven't gotten to the disclosure yet. I hope we get there soon. The harder question is whether you allow the case at all. So do you allow someone to write a case who's financially involved with the company they're writing on? And I think that's a much, much harder question. And on the one hand, my instinct is to say, no, you shouldn't allow that. On the other hand, it is true that understanding the company, that goes back to this very first thing that I said. The nature of professional education is a close connection to practice. So how do you mediate? Let me give one other example that I thought of as Luigi was talking, and is closely related, I think, to his talk. When I was doing some work for the Congressional Oversight Panel on the financial crisis and financial regulation, I was asked to think particularly about financial regulatory reform. And this was back in late 2008 and early 2009. And a lot of policymakers were trying to think very quickly about trying to get up to speed on all sorts of different issues. And this was obviously a complex, very complex crisis. And so they were kind enough to ask for my opinion. And because I was actually, I didn't take any money from the Congressional Oversight Panel, but I nonetheless went through their process, which was they asked if I had any conflicts, and they were quite careful about that, which I appreciated. But then the question was, when they just wanted to bring in almost casually an expert, or some policymaker who wasn't connected to the Congressional Oversight Panel wanted to bring in an expert on some very particular topic, often they'd ask and they'd say, could you recommend an expert? And the problem that I had in many cases is I could not find or think of any expert. Not that I could only think of the best ones. I couldn't find any who were really competent in a very specialized area who weren't in some way financially involved in some way. So that, I think, poses yet another very significant problem, which is on the one hand, that's where the knowledge is, that's where the information is. On the other hand, I find it almost impossible to say it's appropriate that someone who is financially involved in the industry should be giving any kind of serious advice about how that industry should be regulated as an expert. It's fine as an interest, but as an expert. So how do you balance? How do you balance that desire and in some cases need to be close to practice with expertise on the other side? So I liked a number of the proposals that were coming out. I guess what I would maybe raise as a question is whether professional schools have an obligation to go farther in all of these dimensions. And that is, it seems to me, what we've seen as professional schools, medicine has probably done quite a bit better than law or business. But I think all the professional schools have an obligation to go much, much further. In other words, whatever the rest of the disciplines are doing, in terms of disclosure, for example, I think the professional schools should go farther than that, right? Because they have a deeper and more baked-in conflict. And so I don't know how to solve the problem. I don't know whether you say cases just shouldn't be written by someone who has a conflict. I haven't figured that out yet. But I would say that whatever the disclosure rule is, it should be more extreme, right, than what is the norm, because of the inherent conflict in the undertaking that we're involved in. So those were just some thoughts that kind of relate to what Luigi was saying from the standpoint of a professional school. Okay, thanks so much.
And the final panelist who we're going to invite, and then we'll have time for questions, is Oguzhan Dincer, who's a professor at the Department of Economics at Illinois State University.
Thanks for having me. It's a good call. First of all, I'm glad Econ department in Ayres does not belong to business school, and I'm glad our business school is horribly inactive, so we're not part of the discussion here. I'd like to add something to Luigi's talk about what's going on in academia. I think we have also a greater responsibility towards the public. A great example of this is what Frederick Mishkin did just a few months before the Iceland economies collapsed. Most of you probably have seen the movie Inside Job. They actually interviewed Fred Mishkin there. And he goes to Iceland, gives a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, and tells them that Iceland economy is doing great. And very short time after his speech, the Iceland economy collapsed. And he, I think, picked up around $150,000 after that speech. Now, we're having similar problems in the United States as well, especially when it comes to global warming. There are several scientists, in quotations, I guess, they come out and they try to present some data against the global warming, and they are apparently paid by several think tanks or several outside groups. So, you know, it's the problem we have is actually bigger than publishing in journals and making money out of a couple of papers that we write. And another problem with that is some people simply ideologically believe in some of the papers they publish. I mean, they don't necessarily get paid to publish those results. And if you look at the econ journals, if you publish a good paper in a good journal, you have to explain the data in detail, thoroughly, the methodology in detail, thoroughly. So you have to defend yourself and you have to defend your results. Yes, your results may support some companies, some doings, but again, not maybe most of the time, but if you want access to the data that was used in that particular paper, you may be able to get it as well. So you can replicate the study and you can check if there's some sausage making going on or not in the paper. So it's not automatically, you know, we shouldn't question immediately if something is getting published and if this person is doing some consulting, there's something going on there. Those were my only comments about Luigi's presentation. Now, my presentation is more about lobbying and corruption in the United States today. And I would like to emphasize that we do not have enough information to actually inspect the nature of the beast here. We do not have a data set covering a long enough time series to see what's going on in the United States. I'd like to start my talk with this quote from George Orwell. The mistake you make, WC, is in thinking one can live in a corrupt society without being corrupt oneself. After all, what do you achieve by refusing to take money? They're refusing to make money. You're trying to behave as though one could stand right outside our economic system, but one can't. One's got to change the system or one changes nothing. Orwell here is defining a corrupt equilibrium. What we see in the US political market today is a corrupt equilibrium. There are two major players, politicians and the firms who lobby the politicians. If you assume the product of the market is democracy, the level of production is definitely below the optimal level. And neither of these two major players have any incentives to deviate from the equilibrium. There's a third player which has all the incentive in the world to deviate from the player, but it's not major enough. The third player is simply the voters. But unfortunately, voters have this problem called the collective action problem. Since they are really large and dispersed, they can't get together. And we can tie this to trust and social capital. When Professor Putnam talked about trustworthiness, I'm assuming he meant trustworthiness of the governmental institutions. When I say trust here, I'm talking about generalized trust among us. Do I trust you without knowing you? If I have that trust, if we can establish that level of trust in the community, then we can make the voters as this major player in this equilibrium, and we can change the system overall. Other than that, one player wants to do something differently, it's not going to matter. There's a great movie called Serpico. It's one of my favorite movies. It's about Frank Serpico, this New York City cop. He graduates from the academy, he joins the force. He doesn't want to take money from the pool. And he is the only one who doesn't want to take money from the pool. In the end, US government had to send him to Switzerland because they were actually they were going to kill him, the cops in New York City. So by yourself, if the system is entirely corrupt, you can't do anything about it.